Hello and welcome to Games Past Prime. This is a show where I take a look at video games to determine if they are past their prime or not. For me to do so though, there's a couple key categories which I look at. Story, presentation, and gameplay. Then there's a conclusion section where I wrap everything up in a nice little bow. You guys have read the title, you already know what game we're playing. Let's take a look at Pikmin. The story of Pikmin starts by following a spaceship, getting hit by an asteroid and being forced to make an emergency landing on a nearby planet. Once on the planet, we will get to see our first glimpse of the main character of the game, Captain Olimar. Upon investigating, Olimar sees that his ship is majorly damaged and that it is missing 30 parts which must have landed on this planet. Early on, Olimar finds that the planet he is on is filled with high levels of poisonous oxygen and that his life support systems will only be able to support him for 30 days. Pretty convenient that he has 30 days of life support, but also happens to need 30 parts, isn't it? Anyways, upon looking around a bit, Olimar runs into the red onion, which spits out a seed. When Olimar pulls the seed, a creature pops out that he decides to name a Pikmin. He soon finds out that the Pikmin will follow his command, and that the Pikmin can do various things such as fight other creatures, collect items, etc. He also learns that with the Pikmin, he can command them to pick up these numbered pellets. When they do, the Pikmin will carry these pellets back to the onion, to which the onion will then suck up these pellets and spit out more seeds, which will provide Olimar with more Pikmin. Olimar decides that with the help of the Pikmin, he should be able to collect the pieces to his ship to get off this planet. The graphics of this game look really good, like even today good. I think this is partially due to the art style as well as the fact that the camera is a bit zoomed out. By zooming out the camera, it allows them to make textures low res since the people playing won't be able to look that closely at the textures. By having the textures low res, it then allows the developers to make larger maps without it affecting the load times or the performance of the game. Overall, the game is quite colorful and performs well. I really have no real complaints about the graphics at all. I think if you were to release a game today with a similar look, I think it would do fairly well. Especially since today they have faster hardware, so they'd be able to make even bigger maps as well as being able to make better texture quality. Now, this is where we need to talk about the music. And it's serviceable at best. It isn't music that I would want to listen to all the time, but it does its job within the game. The music kind of has this calming effect to me, which is good for this type of game. I just don't find most of the level music to be really all that interesting. There was maybe one or two that I thought that was okay, that I could listen to maybe on occasion, but it just didn't really wow me that much. It was kind of boring, if I'm going to be honest. Like I said, it works well with the game, which is why I'm not really hating on it that much, but it's just not really music I would enjoy. So without sounding too long-winded here, I'll let you just listen to a couple of tracks and maybe you'll understand what I mean, or maybe you'll just completely disagree with me. Now that we've talked about the graphics and the music, it's time to talk about the gameplay. So, I'm honestly having a hard time trying to figure out what genre this game is supposed to be in, so I decided to look it up. And according to most people, it is defined as being an RTS game. Now thinking about it, I can kinda understand this, but I think there's better ways to define it. So I think I'm gonna kinda define it as being a third-person RTS puzzle game. I know this doesn't exactly make a whole lot of sense, but I'm gonna define each of these pieces, so just give me a second. So a third-person game is pretty easy to define overall. It just means you are controlling a person where the camera is following the character versus the character being the eyes of the character. RTS is a little harder to define in my opinion. RTS stands for real-time strategy, but what does that even mean? Well, the best way to explain it is that in RTS, each player is making moves at the same time. There is no turns. Typically, the moves that a player is making at any given time is typically getting resources and building units to take out their opponent. Now, some RTS games are much more in depth than this, such as building buildings to get different units, or setting defenses for their bases, maybe even researching tech to get better units. But at the end of the day, the core gameplay is resource management and building an army to take out the opponent. In an RTS, you don't really control a character, you are typically some type of general that is overseeing the battle, and obviously this is where Pikmin differs. See, in Pikmin you take control of Olimar, and move him around the map, and with him you also give commands to your units, the Pikmin. The different types of commands you can get the Pikmin to do are building bridges, picking up items or enemies, knocking down lattice gates, and fighting enemies. Now there's much more to it than that, but that's just some of the few options you have. Now before I dive into the core gameplay too far, I do want to talk about the Pikmin real quick. There are 3 different types of Pikmin that have their own advantages and disadvantages, and each are used for a specific purpose that will help you solve puzzles and collect the ship pieces. First, you will meet the red Pikmin. These guys are immune to fire, but you can't throw them very high and they can't really swim very well. Next, you will meet the yellow Pikmin. These guys are much smaller and lighter, and as such they can be thrown further and higher than the rest of the Pikmin. The yellow Pikmin can also pick up bombs, and when you throw the Pikmin holding the bomb, they will drop it, and then that bomb will then explode. This is mostly used to knock down solid wall gates that Pikmin wouldn't normally be able to knock down, and even then, these are typically just shortcuts to move through the map quicker. Not necessary, but can be very useful. The only real downside of the yellow Pikmin is that they can't swim, and they don't really like fire too much either. Firstly, you will meet the blue Pikmin, who happen to have gills. These guys can swim unlike the rest of the Pikmin, but like the red Pikmin, they can't be thrown very high, and unlike the red Pikmin, they really don't like fire at all. Alright, now that we have covered the Pikmin, let's talk about the core gameplay. So each type of Pikmin has its own onion, and this has a couple of different purposes. The onion holds the Pikmin, but also will sprout new Pikmin when the Pikmin either bring it the pellets, or the corpses of your dead enemies! At any given time, you can only have 100 Pikmin on the ground. This includes any Pikmin that are sprouted but haven't been pulled out of the ground. The entire point of this game is to collect all of the parts of the ship before Olimar's life support ends in 30 days. With the help of all the Pikmin, you will solve puzzles and fight bosses to collect all of these ship pieces. There are 5 levels, and each with its own amount of ship parts. First, there's the impact site. This is basically the tutorial level, and where you will meet the red Pikmin. This area only has 2 ship parts, so you won't see this level for very long. Next, you'll gain access to the Forest of Hope. This level requires you to have at least 1 part before you can visit, though you get this during the tutorial, so I don't understand why they even have a requirement. This level is where you'll meet the yellow Pikmin, and it has 8 ship parts in it. Now, you may not be able to get all of the parts right away, since you, 1, don't have the blue Pikmin yet, and 2, there does happen to be a time limit. Now, I know I haven't talked about it yet, but I'll quickly address it here. So while the entire game is sort of on a time limit, being that you only have 30 days, but equally when you enter each stage, there is also a time limit. You start at the beginning of the day, and slowly time will tick down, indicating the passage of time when it's slowly starting to get darker. At the end of the day, you must gather your Pikmin and bring them back to the onion since it operates as their ship. The night is dangerous due to the enemies becoming much more aggressive, and this is a danger to both Olimar and the Pikmin, which is why at the end of the day, both Olimar and Pikmin must go around their ship to stay protected from the monsters below. Just know that you can revisit any area that you have already visited, so it's really not that big of a deal. Now, once you've gathered 5 parts, you will unlock the next area, which is the Forest Navel, and also where you will happen to meet the blue Pikmin. This area has 9 parts in it. This is equally where the game stops holding your hand, and the game starts to ramp up not only in difficulty of enemies, but also difficulty in puzzles. After you have collected 12 parts total, you unlock the next area called the Distant Spring. This place just continues to ramp up the difficulty of the game even more. This area has 10 ship parts to collect, and once you have collected them all, you have 29 ship parts, and will unlock the final trial. This area has only 1 part in it, but you will need to fight the final boss to get it. One of the main strategies you will want to use throughout the game is to get all 3 types of Pikmin as soon as possible, and then focus on one area at a time. See, the enemies respawn, but not right away. So if you go to the same place over and over and over again, you can clear out most of the enemies in 1 or 2 days, and then plan out how you will collect those ship pieces before the enemies will respawn. However, if you were to, say, clear out a level of enemies, and then visit a different level, then return back to the first level you had cleared out enemies from, you will notice that those enemies have already respawned. So staying in one level to collect all the pieces at one time is probably the best solution in my opinion. If you plan out the days correctly, there should be plenty of days where you get 2 or 3 parts in a single day, which means you should have plenty of spare days by the time you collect 29 parts. The more days you have at the end to fight the final boss to get the final part, the better. Trust me on this. Now before I get into combat, I do want to quickly talk about the controls so that you can kind of get the idea of how the combat would play out if you were to play yourself. So let's start with the basics. You move Olimar with the control stick. This also happens to control the aiming reticle, which is used to show where the Pikmin will go when you throw them. Next, the A button is used to pull a Pikmin out of the ground when you are next to one, and it also throws the Pikmin that is closest to you. The A button will also allow you to access the Onion's menu when you are standing below them. This will then in turn allow you to pick up more Pikmin out of the colored onion or put them back into the onion. The Y button is used to pull up the map once you have the radar ship part, and the X button is used to dismiss the Pikmin. This tells them to stop following you. This will also split up the Pikmin into groups such as red Pikmin or blue Pikmin. However, equally, this will also group the yellow Pikmin based on if they are holding a bomb or not, which is more useful than you'd actually think. The B button is used to call a group of Pikmin to follow you. The group is based on where the reticle is pointing at the time. The R button on the top of the controller allows you to change the zoom level of the camera between close, mid-range, and top-down view. The L button on top of the controller changes the angle of the camera back behind Olimar. The C stick controls the swarm of Pikmin. For example, say you hold the C stick to the right. The Pikmin will try to follow your command and will swarm to the right side of Olimar. Alright, now we can finally talk about the combat, which is pretty basic to say the least. Really, there's only a couple of options when it comes to fighting enemies, which is basically either using the C-stick to swarm the enemies, or throwing the Pikmin from a distance onto the enemies. The only time you really need to use any strategy is during boss fights. For example, one of the bosses you end up fighting has a hard shell on the outside of his body, so the Pikmin won't be able to do any damage to it. This boss also happens to shoot rocks at you and your Pikmin. However, this happens to be also its weakness. When it's getting ready to shoot a rock, it'll suck in, and if you time it right, you can throw a Pikmin and it will suck it up. This causes the boss to open up its shell, and during this time you can throw a Pikmin onto its back to hurt it. Eventually it'll knock your Pikmin off its back and close back up its shell, then it's a rinse-repeat fight. Overall, the boss battles are interesting and a nice change of pace from how mundane the combat typically is. However, there isn't many boss fights, so while they are fun, they don't last very long, and they are far and few between. The final boss, though, is just kinda annoying. You can kill your Pikmin very quickly, doesn't really take that much damage, and takes really no strategy to beat him. There are 2 different strategies you can use, but they are both fairly similar. It mostly involves taking a group of Pikmin into the battle arena, trying to get him to do an attack that will leave him vulnerable, and praying he doesn't do the one that kills all of your Pikmin. Then, when he is vulnerable, you throw Pikmin at him until he shakes them off, rinse repeat. Now, this may sound like the other boss fight in some ways, so why do I seem to hate this one so much more? Well, because it feels like it takes forever! I mean, the fight only actually lasts like 15 minutes, but when you're doing the exact same thing over and over again, trust me, it feels like it takes a lot longer than 15 minutes. And even then, 15 minutes for a single boss fight is just absurd. Anyways, after you've collected all 30 parts of the ship, Olimar will say his goodbyes to the Pikmin and take back off into space. As he takes off, you are left to watch the Pikmin and see that they have learned from Olimar how to protect each other and fight. And then, once we are in space, following Olimar, you get a glimpse at all the other colored Pikmin following him, showing that there are so many other types of Pikmin we haven't even gotten to see yet, leading into the possibility of seeing some of them during a sequel. The verdict of Pikmin is a game not past its prime. There are various reasons for this, and while the combat is kinda lackluster, this really isn't the point of the game. I know they call it an RTS, but it is more like an RTS puzzle game in a way, since it's more about building up the units to protect yourself and gather the parts of the ship versus fighting and trying to take control of someone else's base. I mean, Here, let's just list the top 5 reasons this game is still worth playing. Number 1. I don't think I can say this enough, but the graphics are just really good. No matter what level you play, you get a sense of what the area might be like. Sometimes it's nice and colorful, and sometimes you're in the dark. The art style just makes you believe this is a real world that really does exist. It's just done really well. Number 2. The style game is an interesting twist on a typical RTS, and does a good job keeping the player engaged and wanting to come back and continue playing. While there are some annoyances here and there, it's not enough to really deter someone from wanting to continue playing. Number 3. The puzzles in the game are well done. They aren't overly difficult to start out, and as you learn what the Pikmin can do, you start to see the puzzles slowly become more difficult, where you need to use the advantages of more than one set of Pikmin to complete certain areas. It's pretty rewarding when you do figure out those more difficult puzzles, especially when you don't look up how to do them. But I am going to be completely honest, there was one puzzle that I actually did need to look up how to do it, since it was too much. My little pea brain couldn't figure it out. Number 4. This game has a solid difficulty curve. It starts out very simple with easy combat and a few enemies, and slowly per level ramps up the amount of puzzles, the difficulty of the puzzles, the amount of enemies, and even starts to introduce even harder enemies towards the later levels. Number 5. Not only is the game fun, but I mean, look at these Pikmin. How can you not love these adorable creatures? They have almost that constant stupid look on their face, and you almost love them for how cute and dumb they really are. Alright guys, that's the end of the video. I hope you guys enjoyed watching it as much as I enjoyed making it. If you did enjoy watching it, please consider subscribing. I make videos every week and release them on Sundays. Stay through to the end of the video to get a hint at what the next video might be. I hope you guys had a fantastic day, and I hope to see you guys real soon.